Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream on the History Light podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Joseph A.P. Wilson. And today we'll be discussing his upcoming presentation at SPL. And it's titled, Is Philemon of Colossae Named After Philemon of Athens? Anti-Aristotelian Critique of Natural Slavery in Philemon. Joe, thank you for joining me today. And can you tell us a little bit more about this? Maybe starting with who is Philemon of Athens exactly?
That's great. We're going to get into all that, the cast of characters and everything, in just a minute. So Philemon of Athens was a very famous comic playwright from the classical period. He was a younger contemporary of Aristotle, and he was a big deal. He was kind of a dramatic superstar in his lifetime, but he became more obscure over time. Some of his other contemporary drama people ultimately became more famous than him in the centuries later. And as a result, now he's obscure for us, but he would not have been an obscure figure in the ancient world. And so I don't know if you and your viewers are familiar with Jason Staples' work, his recent book on Paul and Judaism. I think he says in that book that, like, Paul of Tarsus is a one-sided conversation. We get his letters and we get him responding to a world that we're not a part of, and he assumes that his audience has knowledge, like literary knowledge, background knowledge from the time that we don't have. So we're like hearing only half the conversation. And Jason Staples was particularly looking at like the world of Judaism at the time, which is important, but it's also the Greco-Roman world is the same way. So Paul's audience are going to be fluent in classical literature, and they're going to know a lot of these sort of characters of the previous centuries in the Greek writing. And so basically what I've figured out is that the epistle to Philemon, which is almost universally regarded as authentic, it is Paul's shortest authentic letter. It's sort of like matches the genre of the pastoral epistles a little bit, in the sense that it's a letter to an individual. It's incredibly concise and targeted. It has a very narrow purpose. But that this has always been kind of viewed as just sort of a little oddity, this sort of thing that in the collection of the epistles that doesn't make it doesn't make a big splash. But I just realized that it's likely that there's heavy allusions to the Greek New Comics and to Philemon in particular, but also to his more famous and reputable younger rival Menander. And so, yeah, so the New Comics were like basically the playwrights and comic poets of the time of Aristotle and slightly after, and they were really influential, again, culturally speaking. And their work could sort of lampoon and critique the dominant norms of society without challenging them too directly. Like think about the medium of comedy as a way to kind of poke fun at the dominant views of society at the time. And so I think the way that Paul is countercultural kind of draws from that tradition a little bit. So that's the answer to your first question. So before I get ahead of myself, did you have another question, a follow-up question?
Not at the moment.
Okay, so this work began with my previous publication from 2022 in religions, which we've talked about before on this channel. I've also talked about it with Derek on Myth Vision and with Tim O'Neill on History for Atheists. Those channels, I've done close discussions of that research, where I argue in that article essentially that Paul's authentic epistles are egalitarian, and that egalitarian with respect to women's authority, and that women are for the historical Paul, his preaching partners and teaching partners, and that they are part of his mission, and that I argue that you get a systematic revision of the Pauline corpus, beginning with the pseudo-Pauline materials, so the inauthentic epistles that are canonized. They start the process of turning Paul into more of a misogynist, where he ends up, by the time that canonical Paul is enshrined, and subsequently he ends up seeming much more harsh on women's rights. That the same thing is also true for the rights of enslaved peoples. So the particular context for the epistle to Philemon is Paul's views on slavery, and the context of slavery and manumission in the Greco-Roman world. So the status of slaves in society. So just like with women, I think early Pauline Christianity had a high view of women. It had a high view of slaves. Both women and slaves were people who were reputable, prominent figures within the movement. And so as a religion of women and slaves, it would not adopt harsh attitudes towards the natural rights of women and slaves, let's put it that way, but that the figure of Paul gets domesticated and reformed basically by the Greco-Roman establishment in the centuries after the historical Paul lived. And that's what creates the impression that Paul is a misogynist and somebody who endorses status quo views of slavery. And so this revelation about the epistle of Philemon being connected to the new comic Philemon and his contemporaries provides greater context for understanding how Paul's work may have worked as a critique of ideas of natural slavery that were prevalent in the first century. So, and that's Papyrus 87, which is the oldest surviving fragment of Paul's epistle to Philemon. And it is, interestingly enough, it just happens to preserve a relevant passage. The passage in that papyrus fragment that is preserved is the one that has, let's just say, a lot of stylometric similarity to the surviving fragments of the new comic playwright Philemon, who I think is being emulated and evoked in this epistle. You can go to the next slide now. So let's talk about some of the background knowledge here of Aristotle's view on natural slavery. So these are some of the most infamous passages in Aristotle. These are the ones that Renaissance transatlantic slave traders were like Juan de Sepulveda. The Aristotelian logic of natural slavery has been used to justify some of the worst atrocities in human history when you think about the human casualties of the transatlantic slave trade. And Aristotle is somebody who believed in natural slavery. So let's contrast Aristotle and Socrates for a second. Both Aristotle and Socrates were virtue ethicists. They both believed in a kind of like inherent or that human character was visible to observers based on conduct. How you comported yourself in society, how you acted was a reflection of your virtue, right? And so your ethical behavior reflects your virtue as a person. But let's just say you're familiar with the nature versus nurture debate, right? Like, are you a blank slate, or are you inherently destined to have your character traits from birth? Let's say that Socrates was on the nature side of virtue ethics. The nurture side of virtue ethics. Socrates believed that knowledge could be acquired and that could affect your inherent virtue, right? Like, so what you know affects how you behave and your conduct, right? Whereas we'll say that Aristotle, despite him coming from a teaching lineage through Plato that goes back to Socratic virtue ethics, Aristotle was somebody who believed in natural, inherent virtue, right? Like, so you were virtuous by nature from the beginning because you're you, or you were not virtuous by nature from the beginning because you're you. So he believed inherent immutable qualities to individuals that meant that they were either good or bad. And this is very problematic because he said so these are quotes, some infamous quotes from Aristotle's Politics. It's proper that Greeks should rule non-Greeks on the assumption that non-Greeks and slaves are by nature identical. Anyone, though human, who belongs by nature not to himself but to another is by nature a slave, and a human being belongs to another if, despite being human, he is a possession, right? So he is saying that enslaved people are naturally destined for slavery, like it's an inherent quality that they possess as slaves that comes from their origins, right? Yeah, and he also has similar, and it's linked all together. So the status of women, the status of slaves, and the status of non-Greeks are all linked in this way, and it has to do with their constitutional softness or hardness, right? So like free Athenian citizen males are constitutionally hard and therefore naturally fit to dominate others. And the people who are constitutionally soft and who are therefore naturally deserve to be dominated are women, children, who children at least have that condition may be temporary because they change as they grow, but you get the idea. So women, non-Greeks, and slaves are all constitutionally soft and must be dominated by the constitutionally hard Greek males. You can skip to the next slide, please. So anyone can see that this is brazenly circular logic, right? This is worthy of being mocked. This is completely and totally without any logical coherence, because he's basically saying slaves are naturally slaves because they're enslaved. So the fact of being enslaved means you're naturally destined for slavery. And this is the kind of thing that would arouse people's skepticism even in antiquity. And it's so go to the next slide. And it's been something that modern scholars of Aristotle have noticed. So this is Sarah Moneson, who is a modern scholar of Aristotle, and she says that she just does a survey of the literature and notes that like people want to see the good in Aristotle. Aristotle's so profoundly influential, and he's seen as so wise and so virtuous. And it's hard to reconcile that with the fact that he has this ridiculously, transparently, logically flawed view of slavery. Incoherent, weak, feeble. These are the ways that scholars describe his justification of natural slavery. And she just highlights this as an example how even the finest and most rational people can be corrupted by their own class interests, ethnic and race prejudices, etc. So Aristotle was definitely a product of his time and an apologist for the status quo and the sort of the way things always were in terms of Athenian views of ethnic and of moral inferiors as being subject to enslavement. So let's look at the way that the new comics, whose work survives mainly in fragments, that talked about this stuff. So the main fragment that we're talking about from Philemon, unfortunately, none of Philemon of Athens complete plays survive. And we're not going to go through a bunch of the fragments here, but I'm just going to talk about one in particular. So go to the next slide. I think it's the next one. No. Oh, sorry. Before I get to that, I apologize. This is still a work in progress, and so I don't have all the slides in order. So we're going to run through the cast of characters in our discussion. So we got Aristotle, who's he represents his work. Politics represents a foundational piece of legal theory, right? So the law, as it pertains to non-Greeks, women, and slaves, is the law in Greco-Roman tradition going down to the time of Paul is kind of built on the foundation of Aristotelian virtue ethics. So the two comic playwrights that we're going to talk about, who are the younger contemporaries of Aristotle, whose works pertain to the social and political climate of Athens in the time of Aristotle. So like Philemon the Elder would have been active in his career at the time when the Aristotelian school was active and alive, when Aristotle was his ideas were being articulated in reality. Like, and so Philemon the Elder, who lived to be a century. So Philemon the Elder's career overlaps with late Aristotle a lot. And then his later part of the career is his career is after Aristotle's dead. His younger rival Menander is the other famous new comic, and they both were like competing in poetry contests and drama contests. Their plays were like judged against each other. And when I said before that Philemon ended up being more obscure for whatever reason, Philemon was more popular during life. His plays tended to win more prizes and awards. Menander always Menander was very successful and decorated playwright as well, whose materials were vaunted as well. But he always was second to Philemon when they were both alive. It was only after the fact, in the centuries later, that Menander's work gets like elevated and his plays are better preserved, and Philemon is kind of treated as a pedantic moralizer in later generations. So post-classical period sort of dismissed Philemon as being a little too stuffy, I guess. I don't know. But for whatever reason, his whole plays don't survive. But both of their works get sort of handed down as witty aphorisms, like, let's say, like pieces of like collections of quotes, like pithy one-liners. So if you were alive in Paul's time, it is likely you would be familiar with the wit and wisdom of Philemon and Menander, not through necessarily being comprehensively familiar with their drama or their works of comedy, right? But through their sort of collected zingers. You got me? And so you would read like a collection of Philemon's zingers or a collection of Menander's one-liners. The other important person to remember is the founder of the Stoics, Zeno. So the Stoics were also beholden to virtue ethics. The Stoics were basically kind of following Socratic virtue ethics. Zeno was a Phoenician who was in a shipwreck, and he survived. He was a Phoenician. You know, he was from Cyprus originally, and he moved around to Phoenicia and all over, as the Phoenicians did. And he got shipwrecked, and he ended up in Athens, where he shows up as a shipwrecked guy in a bookstore in Athens and starts reading some important commentary on Socrates. And he's super blown away. He's like, wow, this Socrates guy is awesome. He's my jam. I really like Socrates. So he asked the bookstore owner, he says, man, where can I find someone like this Socrates guy to go talk to? And the bookstore owner says, oh, look outside. And he points, and there's like a wandering famous cynic philosopher who's just walking past the bookstore at that time. And Zeno goes out, and he like ends up becoming, affiliated with the Cynics, and then he ends up founding the Stoic school later. But the point about Zeno is Zeno arrives in Athens around a decade after Aristotle has died. You got it? So Stoicism begins where Aristotle ends, but before Aristotle's thought is systematized. So think about the window of time when Aristotle's mostly known through living people, through his students and stuff, and his library, his writings are held in private collections, like in estate libraries. They haven't been copied by hundreds of scribes yet. You get me? So at the foundation of Stoicism, Aristotelian thought is influential in Athens social networks. So like through oral tradition and whatnot, but it is not yet a literary powerhouse that it would become later, right? So later classical libraries are full of Aristotle, the way that people were already responding to like Socrates and Plato in the literature of Zeno's time and early Stoicism. So the point I'm trying to make there is that both Aristotle and the Stoics have roots in Socratic virtue ethics, but that the Stoics were not necessarily responding directly to Aristotle, but maybe more indirectly, and they also kind of critique natural slavery, but they do it more obliquely. So that sounds all long-winded, but my point is that new comics were critiquing Aristotelian ideas on the nose, if you get it. Like they were responding directly to Aristotle, and Aristotle may have been responding directly to them. In other words, it's a contemporary political debate about natural slavery, with Aristotle taking the slaves are slaves by nature, they should be slaves because they're slaves. He's taking that point. And then contemporary comedians, social critics who are like saying, yeah, that's bullshit. What are you talking about, man? That's what they're doing that in Aristotle's lifetime, whereas the later Stoics, they sort of articulate skeptical views about slavery, about natural slavery, but they do so in the less direct way. You got me? So then what? A few centuries go by, and then we're in the first century. The first century is the period when Paul is writing, and it's the period when the later Stoics are writing. So Paul is a contemporary of later Stoics who have a more systematic view of Stoicism, we'll put it that way, right? So these are the many generations later disciples of Zeno. And so the most important letter of the Stoics is in this regard is, oh, I forgot, I think it's letter 45. I didn't write it down in the slide. One of the letters of Seneca the Younger, which is really closely parallel to Philemon to the epistle to Philemon. So this is an interesting little tidbit. So Paul writes his epistle to Philemon, which is, he says, I've got this slave named Onesimus, I've got your slave named Onesimus, but I've adopted him and he's my son. And this son of mine has been living with me, preaching the gospel for, I don't know, it could be a decade or more. Who knows exactly how long Onesimus has been in Paul's retinue. But Onesimus has been in my retinue for a good solid chunk of time. But he may have been absent without leave. He's like possibly a runaway slave from the estate of the church proprietor in Colossae named Philemon, who's also likely these characters are also mentioned in the Deuteropauline work of the Colossians, right? So that which may have been written with this epistle to Philemon in mind. But so he says to Philemon in Colossae, I'm sending you your slave back, the useful one, on Onesimus, who is now more useful to you than ever because he's your brother, right? So you can think of it as Paul is kind of acting as a parental figure to both of them. He's saying that this slave is now my son, and he's your brother. And so that's an interesting point. So Seneca the Younger, in his letters, has a lot of thematic resemblance, where he is very much skeptical of the notion of natural slavery. You can't be a natural slave if you're of the same family as your slave owner, right? Like the idea of natural slavery, where an individual is enslaved but is like a first order relative of their enslaver, right? That undermines the notion of natural slavery. So what's really interesting here is the context of the letter of Philemon and the names of the recipient and Onesimus. Okay, go to the next slide. This is the relevant snippet quote of Philemon of Athens that is remarkably similar to the same passage in the epistle to Philemon. So Philemon of Athens is directly on the nose here, critiquing Aristotelian notions of natural slavery. So those passages in Politics, the infamous passages of Aristotle, Philemon here says, though a man be a slave, he is made of the same flesh as you, for no one was ever made a slave by nature, but chance has enslaved a man's body, right? So it is absolutely diametrically opposed to the notion of natural slavery. And we see similar kinds of witty one-liners in Menander, but I think the one in this quote in Philemon is the most on the nose. I saw one, I didn't pull it up, make a slide out of it, but in a collection of fragments the other day, I got to put my hand on it again. I saw one where Menander said something along the lines of, is it better to be a slave of a well-fed slave of a virtuous master, or is it better to be a free man bragging of your freedom in abject poverty, right? So there is an interesting thing, and you see this also in the Stoics, that they're not necessarily critiquing the institution of slavery as a whole. They're not saying that all slavery is evil, but they are not. They're claiming that slavery is not inherently natural. It's not a natural condition, but that chance and circumstances, right, determine whether slavery is good, bad, or otherwise, right? It's like the conditions of the slave matter as not just whether or not they are a slave. Go to the next slide. So you can see in the canonical epistles, you can see particularly in the undisputed epistles, the 7 undisputed epistles, we'll get to those in a moment. You can see that they are unambiguous in this line here, which relates to the Stoics. Oh, one more thing I didn't say about Seneca. Seneca's letter was written almost the same time that the letter to Philemon is. So Seneca the younger and Paul are very close contemporaries. They're born right around the same time, right around the beginning of the 1st century. They are, or the end of the 1st century BCE. They're writing in the early 60s, and they both die as a result of probably the Neronian period, right? Like, so they're both involved in the controversies of the 60s, and they both end up dying, and they both are writing letters to friends which are making moral arguments about slavery in that same window of time. So it's remarkable. This relates to the relationship between Stoicism and early Christianity to some degree. But if you look at the canonical epistle to the Galatians, which is written in the late 40s, early 50s, he is again on the nose in describing something that is incompatible with Aristotle's politics. So in my earlier piece on 1 Corinthians, where I was dealing with the controversial passages about gender and women's rights, I highlighted the complete opposition to Aristotle's politics in that passage. The notion that the law that is appealed to silence and subordinate women is Aristotle's politics. Likewise, in this passage in Galatians, you can see that everything that's talked about in that problematic part of Aristotle's politics is being opposed by Paul here. The notion that non-Greeks are to be dominated by Greeks because they're naturally inferior, the notion that women are to be dominated by men because they're naturally inferior, and the notion that slaves are to be dominated by slaveholders because they are naturally inferior. All 3 of those points are condensed into this single passage and essentially refuted, suggesting that there is no naturally enduring state of difference between these 3 categories, right? Oh, and then here's the other key thing. Paul quotes Menander directly, and he does it in a sarcastic way, in a quip. He tends to, and so it may be the case that he has quoted other examples of the new comics elsewhere, but we don't know because the new comics themselves aren't well enough preserved. Like if we didn't have Menander's Thais or the collections of zingers and one-liners attributed to Menander, if we didn't have those, we wouldn't know that Paul quotes Menander in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33. Bad company corrupts good morals. So this is an indication that Paul read and knew the new comics, at least in their like memorable quotation format, right? The kind of new comic material that was circulating widely in that period of Paul which could include decontextualized snippet quotations. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So the fact that Philemon is the recipient of this letter, remember that Paul exhorts people often. He wants to make them behave virtuously by telling them they're virtuous. So he refers to people in ways that where he wants them to be their best self, let's say, or he wants them to perform to act virtuously in accordance with his expectations, and so he affirms their virtuousness as a way of getting them to be virtuous. So you can see addressing someone named Philemon on the issue of slavery and how you treat this runaway slave who's coming back to you. It makes a lot of sense that the name Philemon seems to be too on the nose again in this context. The fact that he's choosing this guy's name here. And he's sending him back no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. So stylometrically speaking, there are lots of Greek words in common between these key passages of the Epistle to Philemon and the fragments pertaining to natural slavery in the New Comics. And this is the epistle where you get like the modern abolitionist sentiments coming out of it, right? Like there is a token from the abolitionist movement, which is based on a lot of interpretations of Paul's epistles, among other things. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So what about this Paul? The opposite Paul, I'll point out. So you have a lot of like sentiments in the canonical Pauline epistles that slaves are supposed to be obedient and never talk back and never be contrary. 1 Timothy, let all who are under the yoke of slavery regard their masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be blasphemed. Urge slaves to be submissive to their masters in everything, to be pleasing, not talking back. What seems to happen, in my opinion, and this is in keeping with my conclusions in my earlier published article about the women's issues, is that pseudo-Paul, the Pauline forgeries, beginning moderately with the Deuteropaulines, or the sort of the moderately disputed epistles, and then with the more flagrantly disputed pastoral epistles later, you have a more like strong veering towards Aristotelian virtue ethics. You have the explicit endorsement of ideas that are much more in keeping with Aristotle rather than in tension with Aristotle. And you can see that these passages of the Bible, like in some cases, were even edited into collections for the purpose of getting slaves to keep their place. So it's really interesting that the figure of Paul is read multivalently, or read in two different, ambivalently at least, in two different directions by pro-slavery Christians and anti-slavery Christians, with the writings of Paul providing the writings ascribed to Paul or attributed to Paul providing fodder for both. And I would argue that the pro-slavery Paul is disproportionately represented by fake Paul, and the anti-slavery Paul is disproportionately represented by real Paul, although real Paul is also ambivalent to a degree. You can go to the next slide. So this is just this is a recent survey by Bruce Longnecker that shows what scholars think about the authenticity of the Pauline epistles. So when we say the 7 undisputed epistles, you can see Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, and Ephesians, or not Ephesians, and Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. With the pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus being the most disputed, where you have, I would say, close to a majority of scholars rejecting their authenticity. Go to the next slide. So these are the 3 categories. So of the 7 undisputed ones, what do we have there? We have mostly early Paul. There's a couple of late Paul. So Paul's career spans the decade of the 50s, late 40s through early 60s. There's only a couple of authentic epistles that are written in the early 60s, the so-called prison epistles, when he's like going into the last years of his life, and the escalating violence in the preamble to the Jewish War. The Deutero-Pauline epistles, which are disputed epistles but not universally rejected, so Ephesians, Colossians, and Second Thessalonians, those are Ephesians and Colossians are late in his career. Colossians is early in his career. I mean, not Colossians. Second Thessalonians is early in his career because it's written in the context of First Thessalonians. And then the pastoral epistles are the most flagrant. So from the purposes of my work, I'm really contrasting an authentic pastoral epistle, which is Philemon. It's pastoral in the sense that it is pastoring an individual, this church owner named Philemon. So contrasting Philemon with the most flagrant pastoral forgery, 1 Timothy, which is the one of all the disputed Pauline texts, we'll say it's the most disputed. It's the one with the least unanimity about its authorship and antiquity. It's the one that even proto-Orthodox writers like Tatian the Assyrian were rejected it. Proto-Orthodox authors like the author of Acts of Paul rejected it. There is some indication that it was controversial, not just among heretics, but even among proto-Orthodox communities in the 2nd and 3rd century. So go to the next slide. So just to acknowledge a couple of important sources, Zamfir and Verheyden wrote an article, Text Critical and Intertextual Remarks on 1 Timothy 2:8 through 10. And that is a really influential article to me, because in that article, they point out that 1 Timothy appears to be a correction of real Paul. So imagine a time in the mid-2nd century where radical Paulists are moving in a direction that's making some socially sensitive Christians anxious. So there's a movement among some Christians to sort of behave more like proper Aristotelian citizens. Does that make sense? And so what Zamfir and Verheyden note is that 1 Timothy is rewriting sections of 1 Corinthians using Pauline language, but inverting them. So you have ideas like blasphemy, freedom of conscience, attitudes towards sex and abstinence and childbirth, attitudes towards alcohol use, who's worse, Adam or Eve, things like that, and women's authority. And this is not just from that article, but other articles have noticed that 1 Timothy tends to take Pauline language and use it to critique or correct Paul, so that the historical Paul in the authentic epistle says something that is contrary to Aristotle, and you can see a much more Aristotelian point of view in 1 Timothy. The other author I'm indebted to is Raymond Collins, who wrote that Timothy and Titus are sort of like the basis for canon law, and that the beginning of organized canon law in Christianity kind of starts with the pastoral forgeries. So I think that given the central location of Aristotle in Western legal theory, it makes sense that the pseudo-Pauline works of the 2nd century that are trying to make a coherent legal framework for Christianity would be revisionist with respect to Paul and Aristotle. You got me? So that you get this sort of reinterpreting Pauline thought, not as anti-Aristotelian, but now as pro-Aristotelian. Go to the next slide. Do I have another slide? Yeah, so let's talk about a couple of other important influential things that push me in this way. So my study of Philemon came out of some friendly arguments that I'd been having over the years with Chrissy Hansen, who recently wrote a couple of pieces arguing against the authenticity of Philemon. Chrissy is basically saying it's like another pastoral epistle or the fraudulent prison epistles. And I have consistently pushed for the majority view that it is an authentic epistle. But here's the rub. I'm also noting that it almost looks like a literary construct, right? That features of the epistle align very closely with features of the new comics. Oh, I forgot. I missed a slide. I just remembered. I didn't. The final version I sent you is missing one of the slides I made. There is a play on litigation. It's a play on the arguments of the litigants. It's written by Menander. And what is the plot of this play? The plot of this play is a slave named Onesimus advocates that his master should acknowledge the paternity of a foundling who was produced by a member of the master's household raping a slave girl, right? So this baby that's found abandoned is actually the child of the household, or the son or the grandson or the daughter or the granddaughter. I forget the gender of the baby, but this baby is actually the child of the household, of the free citizen male of the household. Onesimus is the virtuous slave. So this is a slave that has a virtuous disposition and a virtuous character, even though he's in the same protagonist position in the play that you would normally see a conniving, scheming, non-virtuous slave character. So it's kind of like a normative inversion. So Menander inverts the moral characteristics of the slave in the stereotypical Athenian comedy, and he makes a slave who is an upstanding, morally virtuous slave who is arguing that his master should acknowledge the paternity of a baby that has been produced via the rape of a slave girl. And as a result of winning his legal arguments and establishing the legal free status and the paternity of this child, he is then manumitted and given his freedom. Do you see the thematic resemblance and the fact that the name Onesimus which means useful one, right, is the one that is used for the slave in Paul's letter. So he's writing to a guy who's named after the most on the nose critic of natural slavery in Aristotelian New Comedy, and the other character, Onesimus, is the same name as the good slave who is freed and who forces the master to acknowledge the paternity of a would-be slave baby, right? And what's Paul doing? He's saying, this guy is now my son, and he is your brother. He was a slave, but now he's back. He's yours forever, not because he's a slave. He's yours forever because he's your family member. You got it? You see the argument I'm making? So, but I've been arguing with Chrissy Hansen for years that Philemon is a real epistle, not a work of fiction, not a forgery. How is this possible? Because it would appear, right, that it looks like a literary construct. Wouldn't you think that if you're writing a fictional story and you're pulling these elements out of Athenian New Comedy that it's all made up? So I had a brief glimmer of doubt when I was starting to put the puzzle together, that does this really support the notion of Philemon as a fake Pauline epistle? And I ultimately decided no, it doesn't, because of another influential scholar who I interact with, and that's Richard Fellows. Richard Fellows has pointed out not only that Paul exhorts people to behave better, like he gives them praise in the hope that praise will make them aspire to better virtuous conduct, right? Not only does he do that, but he also gives people nicknames. He renames people in this situation. So like Christians tend to get new names that represents the aspirations of the virtuous conduct that Paul is favoring. So this is something that Richard Fellows has published extensively on. He is an expert in naming conventions in early Christianity. You can go to the next slide now. Some of these slides were a little out of order. Sorry. Just pointing out that Paul's letter to Philemon and the moral letter to Lucilius by Seneca the Younger. These are the two contemporary sort of critiques of Aristotelian natural slavery written in the early 60s. Both of them are likely inspirational to 4th century Christian proto-abolitionists. So never in human history was there ever a time when people questioned the very institution of slavery before the 4th century. Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century, who wrote a homily on the book of Ecclesiastes, which is basically a full-throated condemnation of the institution of slavery. So the birth of abolitionism as a Christian identified movement in the 4th century likely owes something to Stoic thought and likely also to Pauline thought, as it would make sense. But it's so like where the Stoics and especially Pseudo-Paul are very much not questioning the institution of slavery. It is possible, I think, to see an idea of a more pointed critique of natural slavery in the new comics like Philemon of Athens and in the authentic epistles of Paul when you strip away the forgeries and just look at the historical letters in isolation. All right, next slide. Going back to, so this was supposed to come after the slide before this. Richard Fellows has argued that characters in Paul's epistles, names in Paul's epistles, are assigned to people based on their moral qualities, and that they're done so in context. And so, like his one of the arguments that he's made in this regard is that Timothy and Titus are actually the same person, and that the pastoral forger didn't know this. So the guy who forged the pastoral epistles, we generally call the pastor. So when you talk about the pastor, you're assuming a different identity than the historical Paul of Tarsus. So when the pastor is writing, again, decades after Paul has died, I believe that the pastoral epistles are probably written in the 130s or 140s at the earliest. So he's writing long after the original audience of Paul's historical epistles have died, and there's no way to figure out exactly who was who in that period. And so the pastor reads references to Timothy and Titus and thinks they're different people. But according to Richard Fellows, Titus is the Greek and Roman name for the guy who becomes Timothy, which is a more like honorific version of Titus, in a Greek version of Titus with a theological suffix, as opposed to the Latin version of Titus, which they both mean honorable, but one means honorable, honored by God. And so he thinks that the guy Titus gets circumcised and renamed Timothy, but that Paul sometimes uses his old name when he's talking about more secular activities that are not involved directly with preaching. If that makes sense. So of course, so that's Richard Fellows' view about Titus. So Titus gets renamed as Timothy, and when he's being addressed in the context of his public-facing role in the church, he's called Timothy. And when he's dealing with like private financial affairs, he's called Titus, but it's the same guy in both cases. So this is just an indication that Paul might be using clever names for people, just like Paul himself is a new name. That Saul, there's a folk etymology of the word Saul that says it means a tall person, whereas a Paul is a witty twist on that, where Paul has been knocked down, right, and converted to Christianity. So Paul is a small person or a short person. Got it? So like the new names reflect some kind of change in disposition associated with the adoption of Christianity or Jewish, the Jesus movement to reflect Paul and Judaism, right? We're not necessarily calling it full-fledged Christianity yet. But so when you join the Jesus movement, you get a new name. So that, yeah, I have Clark Kent and Superman there. Clark Kent is kind of like when Titus is not acting in his role as a preacher, got it? Whereas he puts on a different identity in his public-facing role as a preacher. So this is where I'm coming from. I think that Paul can use the literary devices of the name Philemon and the name Onesimus to evoke the moral qualities of the critiques of natural slavery in the new comics. But he can do that and still be referring to a historical situation and a real. So that's how I can reconcile the idea of Philemon as a historical epistle that was written to a real person, but also beholden strongly to the literary context. And I think, is that my last slide or is there one more? Oh yeah, this is just to point out that I was really surprised that no contemporary scholars have hit on this yet. I may be the first. I'm not 100% aware of all the possible extraneous citations, or I should say, like, I don't know, there might be non-English language literature, but in the Anglophone literature that I reviewed, I found very little awareness of the connection between the two Philemons. But in earlier generations, so if you go back a few centuries to the 17th and 18th century, you find English language scholars of the Bible who were fluent in both classical Attic Greek sources as well as the Koine Greek of New Testament scholarship. And so they did actually start to make some connections between the two Philemons. So this guy, Roberts here, who's writing in the 18th century, was of the opinion that Paul of Tarsus knew Philemon of Athens. He's careful to note that they are different Philemons. He's telling his reader, so his readers in the 18th century who would have been literate, educated in classical and biblical Greek, he's telling them these two Philemons are not the same Philemon. They're different Philemons, but Paul knew the work of the elder Philemon. So in other words, this appears to be a widely held view in early modern scholarship, and that it seems to have been forgotten as a result of the sort of siloing of biblical studies and classical studies in different departments. That, like, there's no longer a lot of overlap between scholars of Koine and Attic Greek. And that's about where we are at here. The next slide is just another one of these early modern works that appears to deal with both the new comics as well as the Apostle Paul. I have yet to fully digest this Comicorum Graecorum source from the 16th century. And that's about where we're at. And I think we're out of time.
Yep. And just real quick, I just want to say thank you for joining me today, Joe.
You're very welcome. Did you have any questions, or did you have? I don't know if we have any follow-up issues. I can give you 1 or 2 more minutes, and then I got to get going.
I guess I have just one question.
Yeah.
If Paul is writing to a real person, who do you think that person probably was that he's calling Philemon?
I was thinking about this today. I really don't know. It's a good question. It could be someone else that's named in the authentic epistles, right? It might be, I suppose. I'd have to go digging around for who other candidates are. It's a house church proprietor in Colossae, right? So, and although a lot of the same names are mentioned in the epistle to the Colossians, those names are not necessarily mentioned in a way that makes a lot of sense in relation to the epistle to Philemon. And this is something that I know that Richard Fellows is working on but hasn't published yet. I'm hoping that to be able to articulate a more clear idea about the way that the group of people in Colossians relate to the group of similar names. So like Onesimus is mentioned both in Colossians and in Philemon, right? Both epistles. Now, whether that has historical significance or not depends on whether you adopt the view that Colossians is authentic or is Colossians another forgery. So if Colossians is another forgery, then it is, someone's bringing me coffee. If Colossians is another forgery, then it is less significant in terms of the historicity of the characters in Philemon. Yes, and so no, I'm agnostic about the identity. I'm moving my tie so I don't spill coffee on it. I'm agnostic about the possible identity of the recipient of the letter beyond the literary allusion that's mentioned. The letter is too short. I wish we had lost letters of the historical Paul, but we don't.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close. And again, Joe, thank you for joining me.
All right. So as we're wrapping up and shutting down, so we're no longer in the live stream, is that correct?
Yeah, let me just play the outro real quick.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.